In this video, I wanted to start talking about Baudrillard on the negative as a strategy against policy teams. I think that obviously this is something that's going along with the kind of like long series on postmodernism that I definitely want to start doing and talking about more often, and I think will be really helpful in terms of whether or not you're reading or going against Baudrillard. I always think the first step to really trying to figure out how you want to beat an argument is obviously figuring out what that argument says and trying to figure out the ways in which other teams find strategic uses of it, so you can kind of figure out what are the places that you need to focus in on and what are the places that really make sense for you to situate a lot of your offense, and the places that you like really need to cover in order to make sure that your strategy like still makes sense at the end of the debate. And so I wanted this video to kind of develop some of the concepts that we talked about in the kind of intro to Baudrillard video and start applying them to a much more like formal debate context in terms of how we think about the flow. And I'll start kind of with how Baudrillard is used on the negative and how I think Baudrillard teams can better go for Baudrillard critiques on the negative versus policy teams, because I think this is like the type of debate that you see most often, is that a Baudrillard team on the after the negative versus policy teams. I think there are a lot of ways that Baudrillard's arguments can be used against critical teams, and I'll definitely go talk about that. But I did want to talk about just kind of start off with something that I think is like seen most often and common in debates. And so in general, I think when you're doing these like Baudrillard debates from the stance of the team that's reading Baudrillard on the negative, I think that you generally really want to make it really hard for the AF to ever really get to talk about the like importance or the reason for like their plan text or the reasons why like their specific advocacy is valuable, because I think a lot of the arguments that you want to make is kind of winning that your large level thesis claim allows you to frame out a lot of the other types of offense that they are really comfortable with. And in that sense, I think that you kind of have like a place where you really know where you want to focus in on and situate a lot of like your examples and other types of things that you'll work through in order to warrant out that kind of like thesis portion. But I think that that can be both kind of like an advantage and a disadvantage. I think that in terms of the pros and cons of reading Baudrillard on the negative, I think that it can be a really good strategy when you're able to like really flesh out arguments about the way in which war and other impacts are represented, the ways that they produce certain ways of doing politics that do actually affect the way in which politics both succeed and fail in whatever way you want to frame that, but also in the way in which they make it impossible for like people to actually be active agents within the law because of the way in which the information operates as something to actually dissuade the public from actually doing anything proactive to like make revolutionary changes to society in relationship to how science are being constantly produced at such a rate that it becomes even harder and harder to kind of actually understand how that information matters or should be something like life-changing. I think on the kind of con end of reading Baudrillard, I think that obviously I think you run into a lot of problems just generally with like judge flexibility. I think that this argument is a lot of times something that people that aren't really into postmodern literature or people that don't really have the same type of context or introduction to Baudrillard really don't have the same type of I think like desire to really want to get into the things, and it can be a lot harder for them to kind of follow along if you have like really long overviews, or if you're not really explaining things in such a way that you could like give an introduction to someone that had like never seen a literature base before, or that like really isn't interested. And I think that ends just from like when you're thinking about how you want to do like your judges, or when you're thinking about like what type of argument you think kind of just touches the widest range of judges. I don't think this is an argument that does, but I think it can, obviously, if you're applying and execute it in such a way that it's so clean that the way that you're articulating things can persuade and touch enough people across a diverse enough set of perspectives that you're really making this thing possible. And so I don't think it's something that's impossible to overcome, or a reason that you should particularly not read this argument. Additionally, I think that some other pros with I think the Baudrillard debate is that I think that it flows really well together from the thesis because of the fact that it kind of drives itself in the thesis. So the fact that the thesis kind of is meant to make it so that weighing the affirmative is kind of like impossible and or pointless, it kind of lowers the threshold of the standard for a lot of the other arguments that you have to make in the debate, and it kind of just becomes this like win or all or lose all, just kind of throw them all in to like this one set of arguments, even if they end up all over the place. Obviously, you have debates about whether or not Baudrillard is correct or incorrect on various parts of the flow, but I think like really being able to understand and how to navigate this portion of the flow can be incredibly rewarding for making it so that like you don't have to win a strong link argument or a really strong articulation of what the alternative does, but you can win it the way that the 1AC is investing in how we think about politics and its relationship to information, that is something that is parasitic and bad, and is something that should be rejected as how we actually think about debate in this role. In the context of how we kind of like translate some of these like pros and cons into thinking about actual arguments on the flow, I think if we're starting off with the framing portion of the debate, this is the portion of the debate that I think it's particularly important to really look out for the ways in which this team is kind of like blurring the lines between their thesis arguments and their framing arguments. A lot of the arguments they want to make about why you shouldn't be able to weigh the AF are based in the kind of same like information is dissuasive line of argumentation that follows from their thesis. And so I think that in order for you to kind of make this pertinent if you really want to use your framing in order to give a judge a reason to at least give you the value out of your impacts, which I think is kind of like an entry barrier for a lot of policy teams being able to do this, then I think that you kind of need to be thinking about the ways in which you can use your interpretation to like push the procedural. I think when you're reading Baudrillard on the negative, you should be trying to push as hard as possible as to winning like why debate is kind of enfolded into the larger thesis that you're doing. Obviously, debate isn't a separate place in the world, but I think when you're trying to read Baudrillard at its best capacity, I think it's really good when you can translate examples from debate or arguments about how debate works as a place where we implement fiat, where future policies are used, etc., and think about them in relationship to like how we think about the actual changing of politics and culture outside of the debate and how it stretches out, and the like sometimes like the barriers or impossibility of such. And I think really focusing on that question can really like beg questions of like how productive or conducive the framing model that the affirmative have actually does to produce or translate to something broader. Additionally, I think that even if you can win that, like whether or not the judge should like weigh the consequences of the AF, that at least they should start with a kind of methodological framing of how the AF represents itself, then you have like an entry level like response in order to get some of the base level link arguments and offense that you really want to get. At a thesis level, like I've kind of said throughout this entire video, this is a really, really important portion of the debate. I think if you're a team that's reading Baudrillard, this is the thing that you really, really need to get into, because I think that it really allows you to think about the ways in which various examples are really going to frame what the debate is about. When you're able to really talk through a history of the way in which like media kind of plays into various ways in which people affectively believe or invest in certain ways of thinking through the world in such a way that are different from the way in which the reality of such a world happens, or if you prove the disconnect between like the way in which real events happen and our ability to articulate them beyond just the sources of representation that have been given to us, then I think that you have like a lot of room to breathe in terms of like how this thesis is able to apply to not just a broad wide range of affirmatives, but also how you're able to make a really in-depth debate that connects some of these framing level questions to questions that stretch outside of debate and make like much broader examples that you can then bring in much more implications in terms of how you think about impact comparison later on. Obviously, when you're doing some of this stuff later on, you're not really thinking about how you can get this thesis into making a lot of material impact arguments, but you can make a bunch of arguments into how the 1AC basically does pretty much nothing and doesn't move away from the status quo because of the way in which it gets sucked up into all these other things that are already kind of producing the world as we know it as something separate from the events that are happening. I think when you kind of connect that to some of the stuff that we talked about in the kind of introduction to Baudrillard video, you have a really good place to start off in terms of thinking about how you want to read this argument and implement it in various debates. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and hopefully you'll keep tuning in for more and watching and turn into the rest of the Baudrillard series, because I'll have a lot more to share with you about this author and other postmodern authors as well. Thanks.